We are on Egypt, chapter 5 of your world history book, and we're going to be talking about the gift of the Nile, which is Egypt. I like this, what it said in your book. It said, not to know what happened before one was born is always to be a child, which means if you don't know about history and don't know about some of these things, you're just the same as a child, because we learn from what happened in the past, don't we? I love this picture, and these are the three famous pyramids that we'll be talking about here in Egypt. See how the sun's going down on them. The seabed of Africa. Well, Africa is the second largest continent, and it has an isthmus of Suez that was once connected, but now that canal that goes through the Suez, called the Suez Canal, is going through, unites the Mediterranean Sea down to the Indian Ocean, and ships now can pass through, and before they had to go all the way around Africa. So, and this happened since 1869, when the canal was made to separate the two continents. It separates the continent of Africa and the continent of Asia. So Africa is a very area of torrid or tropical climate, and tropical forests and savannas and arid desert. So just about everything in Africa too. But the Sahara is the world's largest desert. That's to know here. So most of this area is the Sahara Desert, which is the world's largest one. Egypt. So we're going to be focusing on Egypt. Egypt was once the most magnificent empire in the ancient world. And it ran from the Mediterranean Sea to the north, to the Sahara to the west, and to the Red Sea to the east. It was protected from invasion just by being there on the sea areas there. Although it also received a lot of trade because it was on the sea. So, and it's a homogeneous civilization, which means that it was ethnically and culturally pretty much the same. So the people that lived there were ethnically quite the same people, and they probably looked the same and had the same culture. Now, we're talking about the upper and the lower Egypt. And that's pretty important because it's backwards than you would think. So remember this when you're putting on the map, because it probably will be a test question. You notice the lower Egypt seems to be in the north. So lower Egypt seems to be where you think it'd be down here. This seems lower to us, and this seems higher when you look on a map. But the Nile was flowing from south to north. So it was flowing down this way. So they would call the lower Egypt being that delta area, and the middle Egypt being the same, but then upper Egypt. So when you look at a map and you think of upper Egypt, it's not where you think it would be, just to let you know. So the Nile, again, is the world's largest river, or longest river, not largest, but longest. The land of Ham. Well, the land of Ham. Who was Ham? Ham was one of Noah's sons. And as you look into Africa, you'll notice that Mizraim was the name of the area of Egypt and the whole northern part. And Mizraim was one of Ham's sons. In fact, Egypt in the Bible is considered the land of Ham in Psalms 106, 21 through 22. Copts were another name for the Egyptians, and they were Hamitic and blended with a few other cultures. So this area became the seabed of African cultures, being in the mixture of African cultures, most of them dedicated to the sons of Ham. So we have Cush from Ethiopia, we have Mizraim, the Egyptians, Phut from Libya, and Canaan, the Amorites. And all these names are in the Bible, and they represent these countries, and they're knowing that these countries were named that. Those were the ancient names for those countries. So going on, Kemet is kind of important because they'll say Kemet in this area. What does Kemet mean? It means black because of the rich, fertile soil, because the fertile soil was almost black and fertile along the Nile River. Egyptos, the Greeks called them Egyptos, because they called that after they had their chief temple there, and they said their temple's name is Egyptos. So Greeks called him Egyptos, and then Romans called him Aegyptus. Aegyptus, Roman, a little bit different than the Greeks, but they derived this area to be called in the end Egypt. So that's how Egypt got its name. Egypt was a magnificent empire, and it started with these little small states called nomes. And then the nomes would get together and they wanted a leader, so they had a strong ruler that would come in and consolidate all these nomes together, and this strong ruler would be called Pharaoh. So you've heard the name Pharaoh before. Pharaoh was the Egyptian leader. So the lower Egypt was the Nile Delta. We went over the lower, so this was the lower again, and this is the upper. Remember, just opposite. Or the lower Egypt, the Nile area, these two different, the upper and lower, would be united at times and separate at times, depending on which pharaoh ruled them. Okay, and Menes was the first pharaoh, and he united these two states, the lower and upper were united together and to make him one united Egypt. He was the first pharaoh to do that. So actually he was considered the first pharaoh, and his name was Menes. So the kingdom of two lands, then it was called. Why was it the kingdom of two lands? Because it united that lower and upper area into two lands, and this area was 680 miles long between the lower and the upper. But it was only 12 miles wide because everybody had to live along the Nile River, because the rest of the area was surrounded by the Sahara Desert, which was very bleak and barren. In fact, 8 million people lived near the Nile River. Considering today, there's probably 62 million people, but back then, 8 million people was a lot of people. Egyptian control. So the pharaoh that united, he would gain control not only when Egypt controlled at certain times. We'll find that out. It controlled almost the whole area of northern Africa and even on into the Middle East. So Egypt would control Nubia and Sudan, that's in Africa. The Red Sea coast, the whole Red Sea coast would be controlled by Egypt. Canaan was Israel, but back then it wasn't Israel yet, of course. So Egypt controlled Canaan and Syria, and that's in the Middle East. And also as far east as the Euphrates River. So even putting their control into the areas of Babylon, where the Euphrates River was. At the time of Exodus, when you think of Exodus, you think of Moses coming and being the deliverer of the Hebrews from slavery, because Israelites were slaves of the Egyptians. And we have that whole story in our Bible. And this was about 1500 BC. So at this time, where Egypt controlled the Hebrews, of course, they're the Israelites. They controlled the Hebrews, and they used Hebrews as their slaves to build most of their great temples. And so a lot of building. So Egypt became the greatest and most magnificent at this time, but we know what happened right after it. We know it's recorded in our Bible what happened as God delivered them, and God parted the Red Sea with Moses parting the Red Sea with God's power and the midst of saving Israel. So back then, the Egyptians, they traded with the Mediterranean, through the Mediterranean Sea, through Asia Minor, and through Mesopotamia. And they were extremely wealthy. The Nile River. The Nile River, of course, is the longest river in the world, and it would flow from south to north. We kind of went over that already. And the Nile Delta, they call it Delta because it looks like the delta in Greek, which is kind of a upside down triangle. And That's the fourth letter in the Greek alphabet. And Herodotus, who lived, he was a historian that wrote about Egypt at that time. He called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and that's where it got its name. It stuck, the gift of the Nile. The Egyptians worshipped the river. They worshipped a lot of things, but they worshipped the river, of course. And they also had what was called papyrus. Papyrus was very important because that became the source of building. Their building materials, and not only building materials, they used papyrus for baskets, boats, mats, sandals, furniture, everything. So the papyrus grew along the Nile River. And also they would take bricks and make, or take mud and make bricks from the mud on the Nile. Here's a picture of the Nile River. Cultural life. So how did they live? Well, their language was a mixed Hamitic and Semitic language that became Egyptian. But of course, Egyptians are known from their hieroglyphics. So what are hieroglyphics? Well, hieroglyphics were kind of like pictograms. So there'd be a picture, but it represented something. And they went from the pictograms to the ideograms and then to the phonograms. And they did that with every language, but you really can see what happened with the hieroglyphics. There are 700 characters they would have to learn the language of the Egyptian hieroglyphics. So in the literature, Egyptians didn't have many books that they wrote, but one of their main books was called the Book of the Dead. And this Book of the Dead, we know about it because it was put in all of the pyramids and all of the tombs. And it had a book of prayers and incantations. Incantations were kind of like witchcraft that they placed in the tombs because those are very wealthy, those pharaohs and the wealthy families and such that were in the tombs at that time, the family of the pharaohs and such, they would think they could take their treasures with them wherever they were going after their afterlife. And so those tombs would be filled with treasures galore, tons of treasures galore. And we know for sure they surely didn't take those treasures with them. Later on, all those tombs were robbed and someone else got those treasures. But anyway, this is a picture of the Book of the Dead. The Egyptian city. Okay, the Egyptian cities, they had capital cities and magnificent cities on the Nile River. And they were centers of worship for their various gods or deities and special places of burial for their royal nobility that were buried along the river. And of course, the Egyptian city would be where the magnificent temple would be, and the tombs would be, and their palace. All this would be where their city would be located. And then around this whole area, they would have hundreds of small mud brick huts, and that's for all of the laborers. And they would have so many slaves and stuff. They needed a lot of slaves to work on pyramids and all of the building projects that they'd have for them constantly. So this here is the Book of the Dead. If you opened it up, this is how you can read. So it's kind of a spooky looking book, huh? So the capitals, well, there were prophecies against these two capitals. Two of the capitals, one was called Memphis and one was called Thebes. And so Memphis was like 12 miles south of Cairo. That's Pleasant. That's where the capital is now of Egypt. Memphis in the Bible was called Noph. So Noph in the Bible. And so we know, so we can kind of know what Memphis was about then. It was flourishing. You know, it was a flourishing city of Egyptians, but then there was prophecies against Egypt, that Egypt would fall and Memphis would be no more. And guess what? There's nothing left there in Memphis but two granite colossi and one alabaster sphinx, which means all that's left is just some remnants of the past. Not many people live in Memphis today in Egypt. Just maybe those that are bringing in the tourists to look at the pyramids there. So, and then Thebes is 450 miles, a lot further south from Cairo, and it's the only necropolis. So what is a necropolis? It's the city of the dead, or ghost town, I call it. So it's a necropolis, city of the dead, and it's left in the ruins of the temples of Karnak and Luxor are there. So you have these tombs and temples there, and it's basically nothing there, city of the dead, just like the Bible prophesied would happen to Memphis and Thebes, the prophecy against Egypt and those cities. Yes, the Bible is true. Those prophecies come true. So I hope you can see this here. There we go. Okay. The government. The government. Well, the pyramid is a symbol of the concept of their state and society. And the Pharaoh was at the top. He was the incarnate God. That means he was God in the flesh, he would say. And he was the intermediary between the people and the gods. And then the priests and officials would constitute the sides of the pyramid. So basically, if you look at the pyramid symbol, the Pharaoh would be at the top, and the priests would be on one side, and then on the other side would be the officials. And then all of the people would be the base, and the members of society would be on the base. So basically, the pyramid is a symbol of Pharaoh, the priests and the officials, and the base. It was an absolute monarchy. That means that the Pharaoh could do anything he wanted. He didn't have to go by the law. He could do anything. He'd have anybody killed he wanted to do whatever he wanted. And it also was a theocracy because it was dominated by a god king, and the Pharaoh was considered a god king. Educations. Well, the sons were sent to scribal schools. And not all the sons, only the very wealthy, royal or noble or wealthy. And the priests would teach these boys how to read and how to write so that they could be scribes and work for a government official or a priest. And so that only very few of the boys and no girls at all would be able to read and write. And these boys would memorize the classic texts and take dictation and copy and do all this work in the temple. So they had the jobs, and the percentage was very low because most of the people in Egypt were slaves. So they would have to learn 700 hieroglyphics. Talk about school, they have to learn 700. That's a lot of letters. And these hieroglyphics would look something like this. So sometimes looking like animals. But like few Egyptians were literate at all.